I want to tell a story in which coded race baiting, racial demagoguery over the last 50 years, helps us understand why today we are in the, sort of still enduring the vestiges of the Great Recession, why we are seeing levels of wealth inequality greater than we've seen in 100 years, why it is that in the 1970s the average CEO made 40 times what the average worker made, but now that figure is about 353, right? So today, the average CEO makes every day what the average worker makes. Why is that? I want to say it's due in significant part to coded racial appeals, okay? So let me see. How am I going to start? Oh, so what are the, and forthcoming book, title, cover, postcards. I'm going to pass these around. The book is going to be out in January, so you can pre-order on Amazon, but otherwise this is as close as you're going to get until January. Okay, these are the postcards. All right. Here's how I want to start. Barry Goldwater. Some of you recognize him. Okay, here's what I want to say about Barry Goldwater. I want to tell two stories about Barry Goldwater. I want to tell a political story and a racial story. Here's the political story. Barry Goldwater was on the fringes of American politics insofar as he opposed the New Deal. So let's go back. 100 years ago, you had the sort of concentrated wealth that effectively controlled the state, controlled the regulatory apparatus. It ensured low taxes. It ensured very few protections for working people. It ensured that the state was not engaged in protection of workers or in trying to create a middle class. And the result was the Great Depression. And with the Great Depression, you get a new sort of political liberalism that understands that the state has some very important roles to play. And that the state, first and foremost, that the state has a role in protecting people from the vicissitudes of either personal misfortune, falling ill, a death in the family, or also large-scale misfortunes, right, like economic calamity. That the state should provide a safety net. But beyond that, there's a sense that the state has an important role to play in creating routes of upward mobility. You may all recognize this stuff as everything that's just gone away in Wisconsin, right? So routes of upward mobility, which include primarily education, but also job training and also mortgage assistance. That the state also has a role to play in regulating the marketplace, preventing environmental abuses, preventing labor abuses, that the state has a role to play in regulating concentrations of wealth, and it can do so through progressive taxation and the downward distribution of wealth, right? So that's the New Deal consensus. And it was a broad-based consensus, so broad that from 1952 to 1960, you have the FDR and the New Deal and whatnot, but then you have Eisenhower, who's a Republican, but he's a moderate Republican who actually embraces the ethos of the New Deal and expands Social Security, right? Still, you have some fringe figures, like Barry Goldwater, scion of a wealthy family in Arizona. He was, and I've got this picture up here. Though he was a scion of a wealthy retail family in Arizona, he fancied himself a cowboy. Not just sort of in the outdoor life of Arizona, but also in the sort of Marlboro Man, rugged individual ideological sense that everybody should be responsible for themselves and that the state had no role taking care of people. And in fact, that when the state took care of people, it infantilized them, right? So this is not just howdy y'all. This is an ideological pose of the rugged individual, okay? And so this is Barry Goldwater. Now, there's no chance that he's going to win election, and that this sort of marginal ideology is going to win election. In fact, in 1960, it's Richard Nixon, who'd been Eisenhower's vice president, running against John F. Kennedy. Nixon is a Republican moderate, committed to the New Deal, and he loses barely to JFK. But there's a sense that there's no political room for this sort of politics. That's the policy story. Now the racial story. How would they create room? Goldwater in 1961 says, we need to win some votes. And the way we're going to win some votes is in terms of taking advantage of the growing racial crisis that is resulting from the civil rights movement. And so he's got this wonderful quote in which he says, "We are not going to win the Negro vote, so we might as well go hunting where the ducks are." Which is to say, you might as well start attacking blacks as a way to win white votes. You don't need the black vote, and you're going to pick up a lot of white votes. So that's 1961. By 1963, that position had gained sufficient force within the Republican Party that there was a faction on the cusp of becoming a dominant faction that decided that in fact, well, let me read you this quote, because I can't do it justice. This is a quote. Robert Novak attended the 1963 Republican National Convention, and this is what Robert Novak reported. "A good many, perhaps a majority of the party's leadership, envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party. Remember, one astute party worker said quietly, this isn't South Africa. The white man outnumbers the Negro 9-1 in this country." Right, so in 1963, you've got a faction of the Republican Party, indeed perhaps the majority, that's saying to itself, we can win votes by appealing to whites. We should become the white man's party in fact, but not in name. There's a purposeful strategy of appealing to whites. This is an important turning point, and I want to be clear that this is a turning point. Where were the parties in terms of race up to this point? Both parties had progressive and reactionary elements. Within the Republican Party, you had reactionary elements like Barry Goldwater and other conservatives who were quite reactionary on racial issues. On the other hand, you had racial progressives within the Republican Party who were appalled by this sort of strategy. Within the Democratic Party, you had a New Deal coalition that depended upon Northeast elites, the white working class, and also black support outside of the South. Right? In 1962, when the American public was asked which of the... you had that in the Democratic Party, and then you had the Southern Democrats. And the Southern Democrats in 1962 were the white man's party, in fact and in name. They made no bones about being a segregated whites-only political party. Right? So both parties had progressive and reactionary elements. In 1962, if you asked Americans which party was most likely to help the Negro, about 22% said Democrats, about 22% said Republicans, and the remainder couldn't tell the difference. Right? You might have asked them which party, if forced to it, was going to do anything. Right? I mean, nobody thought either party was going to be particularly aggressive, but nobody saw a distinction between the parties. By 1964, 70% would say the Democrats, and about 10% would say the Republicans. Why? Because of Barry Goldwater. Right? Because by 1964, when Barry Goldwater becomes the Republican nominee, he begins to campaign on racial issues in a way that makes it clear that the Republican Party is hostile to black interests and solicitous of whites. And so the alignment, the realignment that we have now between a Democratic Party that is associated with minorities and a GOP that's associated with whites, it doesn't exist in 62. It's solid by 64, right? And this is why. Okay, so how does Goldwater campaign? In the South, he campaigns essentially on three issues. First, he campaigns on states' rights. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the term, but in the South, in 1964, no one could fail to understand what states' rights meant. States' rights meant the right of Southern states to resist federal pressure to end school segregation. Right? States' rights was a term that had come out from the antebellum South as a defense of the Southern right to maintain slavery, and then during the Reconstruction era as a repudiation of federal rule in the South, and in the era after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 ordered an end to school segregation, states' rights enjoyed a resurgence as a very powerful and emotional language saying the South should be left alone to continue segregation. And Barry Goldwater campaigns on the basis of a claim for states' rights. His second big point that he wants to make is freedom of association. Again, no surface reference to race, but no one in the South could fail to understand that freedom of association meant the right of white business owners to exclude blacks. Exclude them from restaurants, from theaters, in terms of segregate them in transportation. Freedom of association meant the right of whites to exclude blacks. Right? So those are two issues. Third, Barry Goldwater in the summer of 1964. So one of the big legacies of 1964, and you're going to hear a lot about this because we're coming up on the 50th anniversary, is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Right? After JFK is assassinated in the fall of '63, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, says, we need to fulfill his legacy. We need to pass the Civil Rights Act. It takes 6 months of arm wrestling for LBJ to get it through Congress. Barry Goldwater votes against it. And he campaigns in the South as someone who has opposed the Civil Rights Act. Right? So he's got states' rights, freedom of association, voted against the Civil Rights Act. Some of that might have been just too subtle. So I got to tell you this other story about Goldwater. In the South, he would go to football stadiums. There's a story about him, particularly in Montgomery, Alabama. And he would have the football stadiums, the floor of the football stadiums, festooned with white lilies. And in Montgomery, Alabama, 700 white women in white gowns. And then he would stride out onto the football field and talk about states' rights and freedom of association and voting against the Civil Rights Act. Right? So if those terms were too subtle, no one could fail to understand that he was setting himself up as a defender of white womanhood in the South. Right? A field of white lilies, white women in white gowns. I mean, the imagery is just, I can't find a photo of it. Oh my God! But anyway, okay. So he's campaigning on race. He's also campaigning as an opponent of the New Deal. So, for example, Tennessee Valley Authority had brought electricity to millions in the South, right? Goldwater's campaigning in the South saying that he would abolish the Tennessee Valley Authority. Right? He's campaigning against the New Deal. He's campaigning against Social Security. He's campaigning against welfare. He's campaigning against state regulation of the market, saying it's a threat to democracy. All this. Okay. So what happens? What happens in terms of the 1964 election? This is the electoral map. Blue is Johnson. Johnson represents the New Deal. Lyndon Johnson is campaigning for an expansion of the New Deal, and Johnson wins everywhere in the country except Arizona and except 5 Deep South states. And how are we to understand this? Most people in 1964 understood this as a final death knell of sort of economic conservatism, as a final proof that New Deal liberalism had triumphed across the country. Except that there's a warning there in that red in the Deep South. Because when you think about the Deep South, there are 2 things happening here. One, the Deep South was deeply committed to New Deal liberalism. The Deep South, more than the North, had benefited from the New Deal and its programs and massive federal investment. And yet, here they're voting against it. And 2, Goldwater was a Republican. And you've got to understand that in the South, generations of whites had grown up hating the Republicans. Hating them. Right? And they didn't just hate them because of the Civil War and because of Reconstruction. They hated them because they blamed Brown versus Board of Education on the Republican Party. Earl Warren, the Chief Justice, was a Republican appointee. And the person who ordered troops into Little Rock was Eisenhower, a Republican president. They loathed the Republican Party. And they voted Republican. And so the warning is that coded racial appeals could get even the most loyal Democrats, even those most committed to New Deal liberalism, to vote for an economic conservative Republican if they understood that that person represented their racial interests. And that's the warning of 1964. Okay. Whoa! Now, I suppose all of you recognize, there he is. This campaigning in Philadelphia in 1968, right? This is the moderate Richard Nixon. Wins the Republican campaign. Now in 64, this is a warning, but it's not clearly heard. Nixon starts his campaign in 1968 as an economic liberal, as sort of a New Deal Republican. Indeed, he has a proposal for a flat wealth transfer to the poor, right? Instead of it's just an amazing sort of activist government vision. Okay, but he's running neck and neck with Hubert Humphrey, And to his right, he's being flanked by another Southern politician who's running hard on racial issues, George Wallace. And late in the campaign, in October of 1968, Nixon makes the decision that he needs to shift and start picking up the votes of racially anxious whites. And he does so by shifting to a couple of different terms. He starts coming out against. So it turns out he's already cut a backroom deal with Strom Thurmond in the South, in which he promised Strom Thurmond that he would slow or stop federal efforts to promote integration in the South. Now he goes public, and he makes that promise to the country as a whole. Right, in October 1968, he says, I'm going to stop. The federal government is pushing too fast on school integration in the South. I'm going to slow it down. So he makes that promise publicly. And then he also begins to campaign against what he calls forced busing. And forced busing, now, people have been busing their children forever to schools. But forced busing is a euphemism for buses that take white children to black schools, or that take black children into white schools. Forced busing is a euphemism for integration in the North. And Nixon comes out against forced busing. Right? So he's going to slow integration in the South, he's going to slow school integration in the North, and he also begins to campaign on law and order. And he has these really effective campaign commercials that say, law and order, first right of every American. And then privately, watching his own TV commercial about law and order, he says to one of his aides, this ad hits it right on the head. It's all about those damn Negro and Puerto Rican groups. Right? So he begins to campaign, again, as a dog whistle politician, forced busing, slow school integration, law and order, all of these coded terms. But this is 1968. He barely wins, and it's just not clear whether the race baiting was essential or not. Meanwhile, Democratic pollsters and also a Republican pollster, a Republican sort of strategist, are crunching the numbers. And it's important that Democratic pollsters came to the same conclusion, but more importantly is the Republican strategist, his name is Kevin Phillips. And he published his book in 1970 called The Emerging Republican Majority. And what Phillips says, point blank, is American politics is based upon group antipathies. To the extent that Democrats have started to reach out to blacks, whites are going to leave that party in droves. We can win without any black support if only we start to appeal to whites. And in 1970, reading that and hearing the same thing from the Democratic pollsters aren't saying, their prescription is we need to distance ourselves from blacks, otherwise we're going to go down in defeat. But hearing that from both camps, Nixon shifts to the right racially. And he shifts to the right also in terms of his policies. So his previous sort of progressive policies, he abandons those and he starts to come out much more forcefully in sort of a reactionary policies. You want to see 1972? In 1964, LBJ had won the support of 65% of whites. In 1972, 8 years later, 70% of whites voted for Richard Nixon. Now, one more thing. 1964 was the last year a Democratic presidential candidate won the majority of the white vote. Not since 1964. Not since LBJ in 1964 has a Democratic presidential candidate won a majority of the white vote. And you might be thinking Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton. They came within a few percentage points. They almost split the white vote. And we should be clear, they almost split the white vote because they ran as Southern whites, and they themselves used coded racial appeals, and we can talk about more about that in questions and answers if you want. But not since 1964 has a Democratic presidential candidate won a majority of the white vote. Right? And this is a remarkable shift. Now, people are going to start telling a story in which the country, tired of the excesses of the New Deal, returns to its conservative roots. I don't think the shift from 64 to 72 in 8 short years is about exhaustion with liberalism. I think it's about the power of coded racial appeals. Right? And that's the story I want to tell. Okay. Ronald Reagan. He never was a policy moderate. Well, he was before he got into politics. But once he got into politics after his stint with GE, by the time he gets into politics, he's a Goldwater Republican. Right? He's against an activist state. He's against welfare. He's against public education. He's against unions. He's against legal aid to poor people. All the way down. He's for massive tax cuts for the rich. Right? He's always been an economic conservative. And he always understood the power of racial provocation to get elected. So that in 1968, when he was running for governor in California, he made a big point of coming out against a California law that would have prevented housing segregation. And he campaigned saying whites have the right to discriminate against blacks if they want. Actually, he didn't say whites, sorry. Homeowners. Homeowners have the right to discriminate against blacks if they want. Right? So this is 68. This is Reagan in 1980. Now, part of the reason he's going to win is in the context of sort of all the other economic turmoil and the international turmoil. He's got that bright, sunny, avuncular personality. But also through racial appeals. This is Ronald Reagan. He has won the Republican nomination. He is going to be the Republican nominee for president in 1980, and this is his first official campaign stop, right, as the nominee. And this is Philadelphia, Mississippi. This is where he starts his campaign. And you may know Philadelphia, Mississippi, because 16 years earlier, we say 64 and 64, that sounds so long ago, but it's 16 years earlier. You had Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, civil rights workers who'd gone down for Freedom Summer to help enfranchise blacks. They were arrested by the local sheriff, and then the local sheriff participated in a lynch mob. They were all executed, and then they were buried, and a month later, their bodies were found. This is Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, and there isn't a voter alive in 1980 when Reagan gets there, in 1980, who wasn't alive in 1964. Right? It's only been 16 years. Reagan draws a crowd of 20,000 whites, and before that crowd he says, "I am for states' rights." And there is no accident when Reagan begins his campaign in the South, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and comes out to this crowd and says, "I'm for states' rights." He is clearly engaging in this sort of politics of racial provocation and communicating a very strong sort of racial position against blacks, against civil rights, and in favor of even a violent reaction to states' rights. Okay, so there's this. Then there's welfare queen. Reagan constantly tells a story of a Chicago welfare queen, and he's got some made-up numbers, and she's got so many false husbands, and she's collecting Social Security, and right? They're always saying that sort of never references race, but doesn't have to, because when people hear Chicago welfare queen, it already generates an image. Or one other one. Reagan on the campaign trail constantly tells a story of some young fellow ahead of you in line buying a T-bone steak with food stamps while you wait to buy hamburger. So some young fellow ahead of you in line buying a T-bone steak with food stamps while you wait to buy hamburger. First time he told that story, he told it in the South, and instead of some young fellow, he said some young buck. Right? And some of you may recognize the term. It's a term that comes out of the South. It's got some national resonance. It means, or connoted, especially during the slavery era, especially a strong black man who resisted white authority and lusted after white women. That was the connotation of some young buck. Now that was too close to a sort of a racist statement, so we switched to some young fellow. But people understood the sort of racial dynamics of a claim of somebody on food stamps buying T-bone steak while you're getting hamburger. And the resonance was, it's constituting both blacks and whites. It's constituting blacks as lazy welfare cheats who are getting far more than they deserve, but it's also constituting whites as victims, as hardworking, as the taxpayers who are being ripped off. Right? And this is sort of how Reagan was campaigning in 1980. The Willie Horton ads. Reagan, as an economic conservative, passes the largest tax cuts, corporate tax cuts for the rich of the country theretofore seen. He also begins a massive military buildup. He deregulates the financial sector. It leads to an implosion of the savings and loan market, and the country enters a recession. And he also embroils the country in illegal foreign wars. I don't know if it sounds familiar, but this is what happens in 8 years of Reagan's misrule. Right? I mean, it's sort of, he's been resurrected. He's been deified in part by Obama, by the way. Right? But Reagan was really quite unpopular at the end of his term, and so was his vice president, George Bush. George Bush, in fact, at one point was running 15 points behind his Democratic opponent, Michael Dukakis. What turned it around? This ad. So Willie Horton was a bad person. He was a convicted murderer. He was in jail in Massachusetts. Massachusetts had a program whereby it would furlough prisoners. And you can understand the furlough program. This is back in the days when we believed in rehabilitation. And the idea of a furlough was you allow people to maintain contact with their families and with their communities so that once they're released, they're reintegrated more easily and don't immediately fall back into a life of crime and end up back in prison. Right? And now we've gotten rid of that, and in fact, I don't know, some of the statistics suggest like upwards of 30% of the people in prison now are there having on like parole violation, right? But there are no furlough programs anymore. Part of the reason why not this. So Massachusetts had a furlough program. The legislature passed a law saying that furlough should not be allowed for murderers. Dukakis, as governor, vetoed that legislation. That meant that he was partially responsible when Horton, on furlough, escaped, invaded a home of a young couple, bound the man, and bound the man, and twice raped the woman. But it's not that narrative that really made this story so powerful. Rather, it was that Horton was black and that the couple was white. Right? And so this is the ad, the mugshot. And then it would flash between these two frames. This would be one frame, and then next would flash this frame, and then this is the arrest of Horton, and then kidnapping, stabbing, raping, right? This is a quote worth reading. Again, no surface reference to race, and yet this is what so this is Lee Atwater responsible for this is, but this isn't a Lee Atwater quote. This is a quote from another Bush advisor. Willie Horton has star quality. Willie's going to be furloughed to terrorize again. He's a wonderful mix of liberalism and a big black rapist. Right? And in the month in the first month after this campaign commercial came out, 12% of the electorate shifted their support from Dukakis to Bush. And Bush ended up winning that election in 1988. And there are very few sort of political historians who don't think that this wasn't instrumental in his winning that election. Okay. I want to pause here just for a moment. This could go in tomorrow's talk. I want to put it here, give you a sense. How does this work? Never mentioned race, right? Although race was front and center in the narrative. Late in October, now the Democrats haven't said anything about this. They're not complaining about race baiting. Late in October of 1988, Jesse Jackson is finally sick of all of this. And Jesse Jackson says, this is an ugly racial insinuation. Whereupon the Bush committee, the Bush campaign committee says, that is a sign of desperation on the part of the Democrats to start trying to inject race into the conversation. Right? And I want to say there's three moves here, and I'll talk about them more tomorrow, but there's three basic moves here, and I want to identify them clearly because you see them in almost every conversation about race today. There's the punch, a parry and a kick. The punch race into the conversation through these sorts of coded messages. The parry, what race? We didn't say race. Point to me where we said race. And if we didn't say the word black, and nobody used an epithet, then we can't possibly be guilty of racism. Punch, parry. The kick, turn around and attack your accuser of opportunistically injecting race into the conversation by accusing you of racism. Right? These are the basic moves in American racial discourse today. Inject race into the conversation constantly. Express outrage that anyone suggest that, defend yourself, parry any such charge by saying, hey, I never said black, and I didn't use a racial epithet. And then turn around and attack your accuser by saying, there go the liberals again, always playing the race card and always trying to trade on sort of opportunistic charges of racism. Right? Those are the basic moves. Okay. But still, 25 years ago, what about today? So, illegal alien, right? And there's an important shift. So starting about 2001, an important shift in the racial specters, in the racial boogeymen that are being used in a lot of the racial pandering, and you get a shift towards a sort of an emphasis on brown, foreign, a sort of foreign brown threat. Partly Mexican, partly Muslim. This is the Mexican slide, right? You can see this sense of these invading hordes coming from the southern border. How do you know it's from the southern border? You get the dog, you get the sombrero, right? When we say illegal alien has no reference to race, and yet it really triggers a very strong sense that this is a southern problem. Just an aside, at one point, I have two brothers-in-law. At one point, one was dating an undocumented immigrant from Mexico, and the other was dating an undocumented immigrant from Canada. They had completely different experiences. They could never go and visit her family from Mexico. They traveled back and forth to Canada all the time because she was blonde, blue-eyed, and never feared being stopped. Right. So the whole rhetoric of illegal alien is about a brown Mexican threat. Okay. Greetings from Topeka, Kansas. Kansas, which in 2012 passed a law forbidding any state court from paying attention to Sharia law. Because it's, we're one step closer to burqas than you would think. Right? Sharia law in the heartland. Ostensibly, it's about religion or about behavior. And you hear phrases like, they just don't value human life. Right? You don't hear racial terms, but this is operating as race. This is operating as a threat in terms of a threat from a brown other. So this is, okay, but you might say to yourself, okay, this is still on the margins. Do we see it in political discourse?
And if I become the nominee, I'm going to take a very simple symbol. I'm going to have food stamps versus paychecks. President Obama is the most effective food stamp president in American history. No president has put more people on food stamps than Obama. Now, this is not an attack, it's a statement. It's not negative, it's a fact. I would like to be the best paycheck president in American history.
The most effective food stamp president in American history. Right? And there's that food stamp and blackness being linked again. Marginal, yes, but at one point the leader in the Republican primaries, right? But okay, John Sununu, co-chair of Mitt Romney's campaign, previously chief of staff in the Bush White House.
What people saw last night, I think, was a president that revealed his incompetence, how lazy and detached he is, and how he has absolutely no idea how serious the economic problems of the country are.
Governor, I want to give you a chance to maybe take it back. Did you really mean to call Barack Obama, the President of the United States, lazy?
Yes. I think you saw him admit it the night before when he delivered the pizzas. He said, they're making me do this work. He didn't want to prepare for this debate. He's lazy and disengaged.
So this is right after the first presidential debate between Obama and Romney. Obama's performance was poor. This is Sununu's opportunity to explain why. And he says of our first black president, he's lazy and incompetent. Now, Andrea Mitchell would subsequently ask whether it was a question of being prepared for the for Romney's debate style, and Sununu would answer, when you're not that bright, you can't get better prepared. Right? So he's incompetent, he's lazy, and he's dumb. Right? And this is a co-chair of the Romney campaign. What about Romney himself? Maybe this is happening, right? Okay, so it's in politics, but is it at the center of it? That was one of Romney's major slogans. Obama isn't working. Right? Now, this might, okay, whatever. Obama isn't working. I want you to watch this ad. This ad, the Romney campaign is going to spend half of its advertising dollars promoting this ad during the summer of 2012. Okay, so there had been a minor change. So I mean, one thing you can pick up is this seems flattering towards Bill Clinton. Well, Bill Clinton, as I said, ran on these dogwood themes. One of his themes was his promise to end welfare, as we know it, right? And so there's a support for Clinton as somebody who is opposed to welfare, and Clinton was careful to craft that image. There had been a minor change in the welfare program. It had been requested by a number of states, including some with Republican governors. Right? And it really had nothing to do with eliminating the work requirement. In fact, PolitiFact awarded Romney a Pants on Fire, one of his little Pants on Fire awards for this ad. Right? And it was in defense of this ad that a Romney campaign official said, "We will not let our campaign be dictated by fact checkers." Right? It's not going to be a reality-based campaign. We're going to go with whatever works. But when they went to spend half their dollars, what did they spend it on? They spent it on a claim that tried to link Obama to welfare, right? And so, okay, so what I want to suggest here is we're really seeing that sort of coded race baiting that uses terms like illegal alien or Muslim terrorist or welfare or food stamps to tarnish minorities and to create a message both that there are these lazy minorities who threaten the country, and also that there are these hardworking whites who are being victimized, right? Because it works, right? Who works? Whiteness works, right? Okay, so there's that message. But I want to go back and pick up this other element. What does this have to do with policies?
There are 47% of the people who vote for the president no matter what.
Listen to the language.
47% who are with him, who are dependent upon government, who believe that they're victims, who believe that government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they're entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. But it's an entitlement, and the government should give it to them. And they will vote for this president no matter what. And the president starts off with 48, 49, 43. He starts off with a huge number. These are people who pay no income tax. 47% of Americans pay no income tax. So our message of low taxes doesn't connect. You'll be out there talking about tax cuts for the rich. I mean, that's what they celebrate every 4 years. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never forget them. They should take personal responsibility and care for their lives. What I have to do is convince the 5 to 10% in the Senate that are independent, that are thoughtful, that look at voting one way or the other, depending upon, in some cases, emotion, whether they like the guy or not.
Okay, so back to that one. You recognize the video, right? The video was shot surreptitiously while Romney was addressing a $50,000 a plate fundraising event, right? He's talking about the 47% who pay no income taxes. Now, I mean, it's worth pausing to say, yeah, there are 47% or 46% of the Americans who pay no income taxes, but they pay Social Security. They pay Medicare taxes, and that means that an awful lot of them pay upwards of 14% of their total income in taxes, and that means those working Americans are paying more as a percentage of their income than Romney himself. Right, so we should be clear that there's an important sleight of hand when he says they're not paying income taxes. The relevant question is, what proportion of their income are they paying? What proportion of their total income are they paying? Many of them are paying upwards of 14%, and Romney is paying quite a bit less as a millionaire. But that's not what's important here. What's important is a couple of things. Think about the language that he's using to describe half the country. He's using the language of welfare, of dependency, of entitlement, and of a lack of personal responsibility. He is blackening whites. He is saying of the poor. He is saying of the bottom half of the country. Sorry. He's saying of the middle class. He's saying of the bottom half of the country, you are effectively black. Right? You believe in welfare. You have an entitlement mentality. You won't take personal responsibility. You think food and health care are things that you're entitled to. Right? That's his language. He's drawing heavily on race to say those people who look to government for help are just like undeserving minorities. Right? On one level. Here's the second thing I want to say. Think for a moment about the policies that Romney was espousing, and you will recognize Barry Goldwater. Because Romney is saying, what's his prescription? What's going to get America back on its feet right after the Great Recession? What's his prescription? Massive tax cuts for the rich. Slash social services. A slash federal government generally. Right? And you'll recognize this in Romney, but you certainly recognize it in his running mate, Paul Ryan. Right? Slash tax cuts, massive tax cuts for the rich. Slash social services. Slash federal government generally. And deregulation of the marketplace. Now, we'd all seen that. We'd seen it prior to the Great Depression. We saw it with Barry Goldwater. And we saw it again with Romney. Right? And now you might say, okay, this guy's at war against the New Deal. But he lost. And he did. But not among whites. Not among whites. Among whites, Romney won the support of 59% of whites. He won the support of 54% of white women. Right? Because there's this narrative, there's a gender gap. Which suggests that, and you hear people saying, there's not enough middle-aged white guys anymore. The New York Times quoted a Republican operative saying, we're in trouble, there's not enough middle-aged white guys. Which suggests it's just middle-aged white guys. Well, he won among 59% of whites. He won among 54% of white women. Among the youngest cohort of white voters, only 42% supported Obama. And across the country, Mitt Romney won a majority of white voters in every state but 4. Right? So geographically, in terms of gender, in terms of age, across all of these major demographic dividers, it's whiteness, more than any of these, that shows us how whites are going to vote in terms of Republican and Democrat. And when they vote Republican, they're voting for precisely the policies that have been steadily undoing the New Deal, and that have led to a sort of resurgent crisis of the middle class. So this is the story I want to tell. Here's the bottom line for me, and this is more than the theory, more than the narrative. Here's the bottom line. I want people to recognize that if they're concerned about any sort of social problem which could be made better by government involvement, healthcare, unions, education, immigration, environment, if you care about any sort of social problem that could be made better by government involvement, your efforts are being stymied, almost certainly, principally in racial terms. Right? So when people think about race in politics, they think about poor minorities and what's happening in, the sort of concentrated areas of poverty and sort of minority poverty in Milwaukee or Chicago. And I'm saying no. If you want to understand the fate of the middle class along almost any dimension, you need to understand the continued power of race in society.